This lecture will focus on the early industry and city life in the northern part of the US in the late 1700s, early 1800s. The first thing that kind of started to change is transportation really started to improve in the United States, which allowed us to move around a little easier from place to place, opened up the United States, as well as allowed us to move goods from place to place that we previously could not do. And so we'll start off talking about roads and turnpikes. And so roads and turnpikes, there was a really big, in 1806, there was a big national road that was kind of set up. All right. Some people also call it the Cumberland Road. It went from the Potomac River at Cumberland, Maryland, all the way into Wheeling, Virginia, which is now in West Virginia. West Virginia didn't exist at that time. And really it was the only project of its kind at this point, because when it got reviewed and when people started to look at it, James Madison, the president, said, I don't really think that the government has the right to put money into these internal improvements, as we talked about in the last slideshow, and so it couldn't officially pay money to create these roads. But the roads were very they were not very good according to our standards at this point, and you can kind of see a look at an early 1800s road there. And so how were the roads built? There were roads back then. We know they were happening, and so what was going on? What ended up happening is state and local governments and then private businesses were the ones that had to build the roads. And so in New York alone, there were about 4,000 miles of toll roads by 1821. And a toll road just simply means a road that if you're going to drive on it, you have to pay a small amount of money. And so that's kind of the story of roads at this point. Is a lot of them were pay as you go kind of roads instead of pay taxes and the government takes care of it. Steamboats were another thing. Before, water has always throughout history been the best way to move a lot of stuff, a lot of cargo. But at this point, when you're loaded down and you have all this weight on a barge or a ship or something like that, you can really only go with the current on a river. And so you had to load it up, take it downstream, drop it off, and then bring the whole boat back up. But that boat would have to be empty as you're bringing it back upstream because you couldn't move it easily otherwise. And so Robert Fulton and Robert R. Livingston invented something called the steamboat. And what this did is it had a steam engine that would actually propel the boat without a human actually having to propel it. And so it made water travel much more reliable, much faster, and much easier to move against that current, to move upstream, because it wasn't human effort that was necessary, it was a machine that was doing it. And so this took off very quickly, and by 1850 there were more than 700 steamboats traveling on the rivers and canals of America. And with this transportation, trade possibilities increased. We could trade with more people and trade more efficiently, and so our economy really started to grow at this time. Other transportation changes that helped the economy was the canals. Canals are a man-made river, and so the Erie Canal is one of those. And so in 1825 that was built. It was a very big, ambitious canal. You can see it right here on this map. Okay, it started all the way over here at Albany. Okay, and it was a man-made river that brought people the ability to move on those steamboats all the way across to New York to Lake Erie. And so it connected two previously unconnected bodies of water, the Hudson River, which was navigable from the ocean, all the way over to Lake Erie, which was also navigable by these big ships. And so really you could get your goods all the way from New York to Minnesota by ship, which was awesome. And so that was happening in 1825. Very dangerous digging that. Took a long time. It was about 363 miles long. So the whole state of New York, basically, they dug across to make this canal. Pretty amazing, ambitious project. Railroads were another thing. They were developed in the 1800s. The first steam engine or steam-powered rail car was called Tom Thumb, and they got some passengers on there. And they had them out in the country, and they moved down this track 13 miles of track at about a speed, an astounding speed at this time of 10 miles per hour. So we think that's really slow, but back then it was much faster than any wagons could go, and they could go anywhere that you could lay down a track. The railroad could go, and could go much faster than anything they had at this point. And so, really, more than anything, this helped to settle the West and help to increase trade and improve the economy. And another byproduct of it is from 1830 to 1861, about 30,000 miles of track were being laid down, which that track was made out of steel. And one of the big ways to make the steel is with this coal fire, and so there was a ton of demand for coal at this time, which gave a lot of people jobs also down there mining that coal and selling it, and the extraction of coal shot up by like 20 million tons at this time. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution had been happening. It actually began in Great Britain in the mid 1700s. It came over here a little bit later, late 1700s, early 1800s. The Industrial Revolution is just, if we look at a definition here, it's a change in manufacturing from using hand tools and human power, animal power, to large, complex machine power. Okay, so these big machines were doing the job that people used to have to do by hand. And so what that allowed people to do is, instead of having someone that was super skilled and able to make a shoe or be a blacksmith or whatever, you didn't need that, because all you had to do was have somebody who could run the machine. And so it allowed these unskilled people to do work inside of the factories. And this Industrial Revolution really quickly developed in the United States, and there were some things set up in the United States that helped that out a lot. First was the free enterprise system. The free enterprise system is basically saying that anybody can make money however they want to and decide how to use it without the government being involved at all. Like, it's on people. Money is a people kind of a thing. Like, the government will manage it and make sure it's there and exists, but how you make your money and how you spend your money is completely up to you. The government's not changing anything there. Second, there was this big amount of competition, and the government pretty much let the companies do whatever they wanted. And so all of this competition of having to compete against the other companies created better products, better processes, lower prices, all of these different things. And so the competition with the factory that's making the same thing next door made all of the factories better. There also was basically no trade barriers. They had been taken down, and so this made for a much wider market. They could sell to anybody or buy products from anybody without much effect. And last but not least, America was letting companies become corporations. And a corporation is just a company that can issue out stock, and people can buy it, and they can raise that money. But so those people are kind of owners of the company, but they have none of the risk. So they have very low risk. If you own a stock in a company and the company goes under and they need someone to pay back the building that the company bought, that's not on the stock owners. Okay, you don't have to do that. You can just have basically no risk. All you can risk is the money that you invested, no more than that. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint 1. Some other technological improvements that really kind of changed America and helped the economy. Number 1 was Eli Whitney, inventor of the cotton gin. We'll hear more about that later, but he invented interchangeable parts, or the concept of interchangeable parts. And basically what this is that you set up a machine to make a whole bunch of identical pieces, then again, an unskilled worker can just put those pieces together, the exact same pieces, and create a finished product, a finished good. And so it started with guns, and it was just all of these different pieces, and we have people in factories putting those pieces together, and you have yourself the exact same gun over and over again. All right. Samuel Morse also had a huge technological improvement that helped a lot of things out. He invented the telegraph, which is a picture of the telegraph right here. A telegraph is essentially communication that you can put over a wire. So you'd run a telegraph wire, and then you could electronically send these messages very quickly over long distances. So it would just go over this wire, kind of like telephone, kind of like that kind of thing, a little bit more low-key version of it. And in 1844, the first telegraph line went from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, and you could almost instantly communicate between those two cities. By 1860, this was so beneficial that more than 50,000 miles of telegraph wire were connecting most of the country. And we needed this because communication was important, right? We needed to be able to bring our country together by being able to communicate with each other on what was happening in different areas. Samuel Morse also invented Morse code to go along with it, and so this code basically allowed you to just send this buzz over the electronic signal, so you're basically just interrupting it, and it was either there was long and short, dots and dashes they call them, and so one short and one long would mean A, okay, and so you use this code to spell out the message that you're trying to send over the long distance. So with these big factories and the need for a whole lot of workers that, these factories used to be only in England, they need a lot of workers in the factories. And so the factory jobs brought a bunch of people from these rural areas, farms and in the country, to towns, to cities. And so these cities started to grow. These cities' populations grew huge. Most cities grew by 2 or 3 times as many people as they began with. And New York City was the largest of these cities and showed the largest growth. And because it was this center for business and this center for factories and all this kind of stuff, it also became a financial center. At Wall Street, New York Stock Exchange, these things started to blossom and become bigger and more powerful financial systems in America and in the world. But these factory workers, of which there were about 1.3 million by the time we hit 1860, they faced a lot of challenges and a lot of problems. They faced long days, these long hours, low pay, and unsafe working conditions where you could easily get hurt, killed on the job, you're having to show up sick, all these different kinds of things. And so some workers decided to join labor unions. It wasn't a huge thing at this time, but we saw our very first labor unions forming in America. A labor union is just a group of workers, usually all from one group. One might be one company, it might be one type of employee, one job. Okay, they form together into a group to improve conditions for its members. And so, like I said, most of them focus on a single job or a single place. Okay, and some of the simple things that they wanted is they wanted a little bit higher wages, more money, which is what unions always want and people always want. And then also they wanted to bring down the hours to only 10 hours of work per day. So the unions really at first they were not very successful. The companies wouldn't recognize them or negotiate with them or anything, so their power was kind of gone there. And then they didn't really have the power or the money to do kind of the biggest thing that a labor union can do, which is strikes. Strike is just when the whole group of people, the whole union, just stops working. And if they stop working, that shuts down the factory, shuts down the person's business who's running it, and forces them to come and talk to you and try and meet your demands so that you'll come back to work and get their business up and running. They can make money again. But the courts at this point were saying, yeah, it's illegal. You can't do that. Okay, they said it's illegal to have a strike, and it stops free enterprise, and we don't want that happening. There were some victories in the early years of the unions. In 1840, President Van Buren, right down here, kind of funny looking president guy, Martin Van Buren, he made the federal employee workday 10 hours, so that was beneficial and started moving us towards a smaller workday. And then in 1842, a Supreme Court case, Commonwealth versus Hunt, in the Massachusetts Supreme Court, says strikes are legal. So this started the precedent that labor unions would be able to strike, which eventually it's going to take some time, but grew into today where it's generally legal to strike for a labor union. Take a moment to write out the answer for checkpoint number 2. So these big cities and more people living in them caused a bunch of problems, and the people responded, and some things got better because of these problems. So you had to have the problem for people to make the innovations and the changes to things that we enjoy today. And so there was higher crime and labor riots as people were moving together. There was more criminals. There were more people trying to prey on people. And so with this increased crime, we saw the need to have police. And so the police departments were made back in this Industrial Revolution time. Also, all of these buildings close together in a city, you can see our 1800 city here, they were all made out of wood and very close together, so if something started a fire, it could easily spread and really be devastating for an entire city. And so the fire departments that existed for a very long time, since colonial times, were always volunteer, and people just, did the best that they could, but they became very professional and paid, which allowed them to get much better at fighting those fires. Another problem with all these people together is the garbage that they produced and the human waste that they produced overwhelmed the sanitation systems. The sanitation systems were not set up for that many people, and so many improvements were made to the garbage and sewer systems in the cities in the north. Also, women had very little access to work or education, and something weird that was happening is the bakeries, the butcher shops, the clothers, the candle shops, all of these people had come in, and they were doing all the work that the women used to have to do within the house. And so now they had time to work, but they didn't really have that much access to work or education. And so this work opportunities started to pop up within the factories. And then also the limited public education. Not very many places had public schooling. It was just hard to get your hands on public schooling. And so for most people, reading had to be taught in the home. But interestingly enough, it was taught pretty successfully. And there was about over 90% of the population was literate, of the white population, and 80% of the total population was literate, according to the 1840 census. It was just family members, churches, private schools, tutors, if you could afford them. That's how you learned how to read and did school, basically. Many slaves that were able to get away came also to those northern cities. Most of them still remain poor. They worked in these low-skilled jobs as maybe servants or dock workers, anything that they could possibly do that weren't already filled up. But there was a small middle class in some of these larger cities that started to get better jobs and started to get some social class and power built up in the north there. Also in the north, agriculture was still the main economic activity. So there's lots of factories, lots of new stuff happening, everybody's moving to the cities, but the main activity is still agriculture, so don't get that wrong. The entire family on a farm shared that work, and they did make enough to sell their extra into the cities, which really, that's important, right? The agriculture, the food that we make are able to keep the economy, keep the cities going, because the city is not making any food, right? They can't feed all of the people in it if the farmers aren't out there making the food that we need. And so as the north is starting to shift into manufacturing and into these cities, the south turns and focuses even more on the farming, which of course means that they're focusing even more on the need for their labor force, which is slaves. And so we'll talk more about the slaves in the next set of notes. Take a minute to write out 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any, then you can just create 3 test questions that you might see on a quiz or a test for this material.